Utah's landscape spans desert basins, alpine forests, and plateau country, creating ecological zones that supported distinct patterns of human adaptation for over 12,000 years. The region contains the Great Basin to the west, the Colorado Plateau to the east, and transitional valleys between these provinces. Archaeological evidence from dry caves and rock shelters has preserved organic materials rarely found elsewhere, providing detailed records of subsistence and technology. The scale of human presence varied considerably across time and space. Researchers debate population levels, migration patterns, and the timing of cultural transitions. Much remains unknown about social organization and the relationships between regional groups. The archaeological record is incomplete, with site preservation depending heavily on environmental conditions and the intensity of modern land use. Utah's environmental diversity created a mosaic of habitats that shaped human occupation patterns throughout prehistory. The Great Basin occupies the western portion of the state, characterized by internal drainage systems where water flows into closed basins rather than reaching the ocean. Mountain ranges run north to south, separating valleys with ephemeral lakes and playas. Elevations range from below 4,000 feet in desert valleys to over 13,000 feet on mountain peaks. The Colorado Plateau dominates eastern Utah, featuring deeply incised canyons, mesas, and sandstone formations. The Green River and Colorado River systems drain this region, creating ribbons of riparian habitat through otherwise arid terrain. These waterways provided concentrated resources and travel corridors. Between the Great Basin and Colorado Plateau lies a transition zone with characteristics of both provinces. Climate varies dramatically with elevation and geography. Lower desert basins receive less than 8 inches of annual precipitation, while high mountain zones may receive over 40 inches, much of it as snow. Temperature extremes are significant, with summer highs exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit in valleys and winter lows dropping well below zero at higher elevations. Vegetation communities reflect these gradients. Sagebrush and shad scale dominate lower elevations. Pinyon juniper woodlands occur at middle elevations, typically between 5,000 and 7,000 feet. Ponderosa pine, Douglas fir, and aspen forests grow at higher elevations. Alpine tundra exists above tree line on the highest peaks. Water availability structured human settlement choices. Permanent springs and seeps were critical resources in arid zones. Seasonal streams provided water during snowmelt, but dried during summer months. Marshlands formed around the edges of ancient lakes, supporting dense concentrations of birds, fish, and edible plants. The Great Salt Lake and Utah Lake represent remnants of much larger Pleistocene water bodies. Ancient Lake Bonneville covered much of western Utah during the last glacial maximum, reaching depths of over 1,000 feet and covering an area larger than Lake Michigan. As climate warmed, this massive lake receded, leaving behind terraces, beach ridges, and extensive salt flats. The shrinking of Lake Bonneville transformed the region's ecology, eliminating lacustrine resources and exposing new land surfaces for human use. Animal populations varied by habitat. Bighorn sheep inhabited rocky canyon country and mountain slopes. Mule deer ranged across multiple elevation zones, migrating seasonally between summer and winter ranges. Pronghorn antelope occupied open valleys and plains. Small mammals including rabbits, hares, and rodents were abundant and constituted important prey. Waterfowl concentrated at marshes and lake margins during migration periods. Fish populations existed in major river systems and some lakes, though fish were absent from many smaller streams and ephemeral water sources. Bison presence in Utah remains debated, with limited evidence suggesting occasional use of some valleys by small herds, particularly in northern areas. Elk occupied forested mountain zones. Plant resources showed strong elevational patterning. Pinyon pine nuts became available in middle-elevation woodlands during fall, providing a storable, high-calorie food source. Harvests varied annually depending on climatic conditions, with productive years occurring irregularly. Grasslands and meadows produced numerous seed-bearing plants, including grasses, chenopod's, and amaranths. These small seeds required intensive processing, but were reliably available. Roots and bulbs could be harvested in spring and early summer. Prickly pear cactus pads and fruits provided food in lower desert zones. Yucca offered edible flowers, fruits, and fiber for cordage. Serviceberries, chokecherries, and currants ripened in mountain zones during summer. The diversity of plant resources meant that different zones offered different seasonal opportunities, encouraging mobility or trade between groups occupying distinct territories. Geological resources influence technological choices. Obsidian outcrops in volcanic areas provided high-quality material for stone tools, with sources in Utah and neighboring regions supplying raw material that moved through exchange networks. Quartzite, chert, and chalcedony occurred in sedimentary formations and served as alternative toolstone materials. Basalt provided material for grinding implements. Clay deposits suitable for ceramic production existed in many areas, though pottery manufacture did not become widespread until relatively late in the prehistoric sequence. Salt could be collected from evaporate deposits. Pigments for rock art and other purposes came from iron oxide deposits and other mineral sources. The environmental framework established constraints and opportunities for human groups. Resource distribution was patchy rather than uniform, creating areas of relative abundance and scarcity. Seasonal variation meant that optimal resource locations changed throughout the year. Elevation gradients compressed multiple ecological zones within short distances, allowing groups to access different resources through relatively modest movements. Water scarcity in lower elevations limited the duration of occupation at many locations, requiring either mobility or reliance on a few reliable water sources. The preservation of organic materials in dry caves and rock shelters created an archaeological record richer in detail than in most other regions, allowing researchers to reconstruct subsistence practices and technologies with unusual precision. Environmental conditions also influenced site visibility and discovery, with open-air sites in some areas eroded or buried, while sheltered locations preserved evidence of human activity across millennia. The interaction between humans and this diverse landscape forms the foundation for understanding prehistoric adaptations in Utah. Evidence of human presence in Utah extends back to the terminal Pleistocene, though the precise timing and nature of initial colonization remains debated among researchers. The earliest widely accepted archaeological materials belong to the Paleo-Indian period, spanning roughly 11,500 to 8,000 years before present. Fluted projectile points characteristic of Clovis culture have been found at scattered locations across the state, though in relatively small numbers compared to the Great Plains or other regions. These distinctive lanceolate points feature a flute or channel flake removed from the base, facilitating hafting to wooden shafts. Clovis points in Utah come primarily from surface contexts rather than stratified archaeological deposits, limiting chronological precision and contextual information. The distribution of Clovis materials suggests low population density and high mobility. Isolated finds occur in multiple environmental zones, from desert basins to high valleys, indicating that early groups moved across varied terrain. No-kill sites or camps with dense concentrations of Clovis artifacts have been definitively identified in Utah, contrasting with better documented Clovis occupations elsewhere in North America. This scarcity may reflect actual low population levels, poor preservation, burial of sites under later sediments, or insufficient archaeological survey coverage. Researchers debate whether Clovis groups regularly inhabited Utah or passed through the region intermittently while ranging across larger territories. Following Clovis, several distinct projectile point styles appear in the archaeological record, including Folsom, agate basin, and various stemmed forms. Folsom points, like Clovis examples, show fluting but are generally smaller and more finely made. Folsom materials in Utah remain scarce, known primarily from surface finds and isolated specimens. The rarity of Folsom points may indicate that groups manufacturing this technology concentrated their activities in regions with more abundant large game, particularly bison herds on the plains. Alternatively, small populations may have produced limited material signatures that are difficult to detect archaeologically. Western stemmed projectile points represent another early tradition, characterized by broad stems and shoulders without fluting. These points occur in the Great Basin and Pacific Coast regions, with examples found in western Utah. Chronological relationships between fluted point traditions and stemmed traditions remain disputed. Some researchers argue that western stemmed points predate Clovis in the Great Basin, suggesting an early coastal migration route into the Americas. Others maintain that stemmed points are contemporaneous with or slightly later than Clovis. Dating these early occupations proves challenging due to the scarcity of stratified sites with reliable radiocarbon dates and clear associations between artifacts and datable materials. Danger Cave, located in the western Great Basin portion of Utah, provides some of the earliest stratified evidence of human occupation. Excavations revealed cultural deposits extending back approximately 11,000 years. The lowest occupation levels contained fragments of basketry, cordage, and wooden implements, along with stone tools and animal bones. Radiocarbon dates from these early levels place occupation during the terminal Pleistocene and early Holocene transition. The preserved organic materials demonstrate technological sophistication in fiber working and tool manufacture. Evidence indicates exploitation of marsh resources, small mammals, and plant foods rather than focus on large game hunting. Hogup Cave, also in western Utah near the Great Salt Lake, shows a similar pattern of early occupation. The site contains stratified deposits spanning over 8,000 years, with the earliest levels dating to approximately 9,000 years before present. Early occupants utilized the cave as a temporary camp, leaving behind stone tools, bone implements, and processed plant remains. The site's location near ancient marsh environments provided access to waterfowl and wetland plants. Preservation conditions allowed recovery of normally perishable items, including basketry fragments and vegetal materials showing evidence of processing. The early Holocene environment differed substantially from modern conditions. Climate during the terminal Pleistocene was cooler and wetter than present, supporting more extensive vegetation cover and larger water bodies. As the climate warmed following the end of the Ice Age, lakes and marshes began to contract. Lake Bonneville had already receded significantly by the time humans arrived, but smaller successor lakes still covered considerable areas. These shrinking water bodies concentrated resources along shorelines and in remaining wetlands, potentially attracting human settlement. The environmental transition from Pleistocene to Holocene conditions required adaptive responses from human populations, though the specifics of these adjustments remain poorly understood due to limited archaeological evidence from this transitional period. Stone tool technology in the earliest periods emphasized bifacial reduction and production of projectile points, knives, and scrapers. Early groups transported toolstone materials over considerable distances, either through direct movement across landscapes or through exchange with other groups. Obsidian sourcing studies reveal that toolstone from specific geological sources moved tens or even hundreds of miles from origin points, demonstrating either high individual mobility or intergroup transfer of materials. Ground stone tools appear infrequently in the earliest assemblages, suggesting that plant processing, while present, had not yet achieved the intensity characteristic of later periods. Faunal remains from early sites show exploitation of diverse animal species rather than specialized focus on particular prey. Bones of rabbits, hares, and small rodents appear frequently, indicating that small game hunting contributed substantially to subsistence. Larger mammals, including deer and sheep, occur in lower frequencies. Bird bones from waterfowl and other species demonstrate use of avian resources. The overall pattern suggests a broad-spectrum subsistence strategy targeting whatever resources were locally available rather than specialized hunting of particular species. The question of pre-Clovis occupation in Utah remains unresolved. Some researchers argue that humans may have entered the Americas earlier than the Clovis period, potentially before 13,000 years ago. Claimed pre-Clovis sites in other regions remain controversial, and no definitive pre-Clovis materials have been documented in Utah. The absence of evidence does not prove absence, as early sites may be buried, destroyed, or simply not yet discovered. However, current data does not support secure human presence before the Clovis period. Population levels during the Paleo-Indian period appear to have been low throughout Utah. The scattered distribution of diagnostic artifacts and the absence of large occupation sites suggest small, mobile groups ranging across extensive territories. These groups likely consisted of extended family bands, numbering perhaps 20 to 50 individuals, though such estimates remain highly speculative. Interaction between groups probably occurred at resource concentration points or during seasonal aggregations, facilitating exchange of materials, information, and potentially métis. The overall picture emerging from this earliest period shows successful human adaptation to Utah's diverse environments through mobility, technological versatility, and broad-spectrum resource use, establishing patterns that would persist and intensify in subsequent millennia. The Archaic period in Utah spans approximately 8,000 years, from roughly 8,000 to 2,000 years before present, representing the longest cultural interval in the region's prehistory. This extended timeframe encompasses substantial environmental change, technological innovation, and increasing diversification of regional adaptations. Researchers divide the Archaic into early, middle, and late subperiods, though the boundaries between these divisions remain somewhat arbitrary and vary by locality. The Archaic is characterized by hunting and gathering economies without agriculture, increasing use of plant processing technologies, and gradual shifts toward reduced mobility in some areas. The early Archaic corresponds roughly to the period from 8,000 to 5,000 years before present. Climate during this interval was generally warmer and drier than preceding millennia, a trend that continued through much of the Middle Archaic. This warming and drying caused further contraction of Pleistocene lakes and marshes, fundamentally altering resource distributions. The Great Salt Lake reached its lowest historical levels during portions of this period, exposing extensive mudflats and reducing wetland habitats. Many smaller lakes dried completely. These environmental changes forced adaptive responses from human populations dependent on lacustrine and marsh resources. Projectile point styles changed during the early Archaic, with new forms replacing Paleo-Indian types. Large corner-notched and side-notched points became common, representing a shift from lanceolate forms. These notched points facilitated different hafting methods and may reflect changes in hunting strategies or weapons technology. The transition from atlatl and dart systems to later bow and arrow technology would not occur until much later, so early and middle Archaic hunters continued using spear throwers for projectile delivery. Point styles show regional variation, with different forms predominating in the eastern Colorado Plateau versus western Great Basin portions of Utah, suggesting emerging regional traditions. Ground stone technology expanded significantly during the Archaic period. Manos and metates for grinding seeds became increasingly common in archaeological assemblages. These tools consist of handheld grinding stones worked against larger stone slabs or basins. The appearance and proliferation of grinding implements indicates intensified processing of small seeds from grasses, ctenopods, and other plants. Seed grinding is labor-intensive, requiring substantial time investment to produce usable quantities of flour or meal. The adoption of this technology suggests either population pressure, requiring use of more marginal foods, environmental changes reducing availability of preferred resources, or cultural preferences for particular food types. Mortars and pestles also appear, used for pounding rather than grinding, suitable for processing nuts, roots, and other plant materials. Cave and rock shelter sites continue to provide the most detailed evidence for Archaic period lifeways due to excellent preservation of organic materials. Danger cave deposits from the Archaic period contain basketry, cordage, netting, and wooden tools alongside stone implements. Different basket forms served distinct functions, including conical burden baskets for transport, close-twined containers for storage, and open-twined trays for winnowing seeds. The sophistication of fiber technologies demonstrates advanced knowledge of plant materials and weaving techniques. Cordage manufacturing required processing plant fibers through multiple stages, including collection, drying, splitting, and twisting. Nets served for capturing rabbits and other small game, with some examples measuring many meters in length, suggesting communal hunting activities. Haugup Cave yielded extensive Archaic period deposits, showing continuous or repeated occupation. Materials recovered include over 2,000 projectile points and point fragments, thousands of pieces of flaked stone debris from tool manufacture, grinding stones, and abundant organic remains. Plant materials in the deposits indicate collection of pickleweed seeds, bulrush seeds, and other marsh plants. Animal bones show continued focus on small mammals, particularly jackrabbits, along with lesser amounts of waterfowl and occasional larger mammals. The pattern suggests consistent exploitation of resources available near the cave, with occupants returning repeatedly to this location over millennia. Cowboy Cave in southeastern Utah provides evidence for Archaic occupation on the Colorado Plateau. The site contained stratified deposits with excellent preservation of organic materials. Basketry fragments showed distinct construction techniques from Great Basin examples, reflecting regional variation in manufacturing traditions. Projectile points from the site include forms typical of the Colorado Plateau region. Plant remains indicate use of pinyon nuts, grass seeds, and various other vegetal resources. The site's location in canyon country provided access to riparian resources along streams and access to multiple elevation zones within short distances. During the Middle Archaic, roughly 5,000 to 3,000 years before present, environmental conditions remained warm and dry. Archaeological evidence suggests continued low population densities with high mobility. Some areas may have been abandoned or used only seasonally during the driest intervals. Site distributions shift somewhat compared to earlier periods, possibly reflecting movements to areas with more reliable water sources. The number of dated components from this interval is relatively low compared to earlier and later periods, though whether this reflects actual population decline or archaeological sampling issues remains debated. The late Archaic, approximately 3,000 to 2,000 years before present, shows evidence of population increase and changing settlement patterns. Climate became somewhat cooler and wetter, expanding marsh habitats and increasing the productivity of some resource zones. The number of archaeological sites increases during this interval, suggesting demographic growth or more intensive use of the landscape. In some areas, particularly along major river valleys and near reliable springs, evidence suggests longer occupation durations and possible seasonal sedentism, though full year-round occupation at single locations remained rare. Subsistence strategies during the late Archaic showed increasing regional differentiation. In western Utah, groups continued exploiting marsh resources, small game, and seeds. In eastern portions of the state, pinyon nut harvesting became increasingly important where woodlands existed. Nuts provided dense calories and could be stored for winter consumption. However, pinyon harvests vary substantially from year to year, with productive years occurring irregularly. Groups dependent on pinyon required either backup resources or mobility to areas where harvests succeeded. Some researchers argue that pinyon dependence developed relatively late, perhaps during the late Archaic, while others suggest earlier exploitation. Storage technology became more elaborate during the late Archaic. Lined storage pits appear at some sites, indicating food caching. Basketry containers suitable for storage show refinements in construction. The development of storage capabilities allowed accumulation of surplus from productive seasons, buffering against resource shortfalls. Storage also facilitated reduced mobility, as groups could remain at favored locations while drawing on cached foods rather than moving to find immediate resources. However, storage also created vulnerability to theft and required defending cached resources or maintaining them in secure locations. Trade networks during the Archaic period are evidenced by movement of exotic materials. Obsidian from sources in Utah and neighboring regions appears at sites hundreds of kilometers from source locations. Marine shell from the Pacific coast reached interior Utah sites, demonstrating either direct long-distance movement or down-the-line exchange through multiple groups. These materials typically appear in small quantities, suggesting occasional rather than systematic exchange. The mechanisms of exchange remain unclear, possibly involving seasonal gatherings where multiple groups aggregated for social and economic interactions. Burial practices during the Archaic period are poorly documented due to the rarity of discovered burials. The few known Archaic burials show variable treatment, with some individuals interred in flexed positions and others extended. Grave goods occur inconsistently, with some burials containing tools or ornaments, while others lack associated artifacts. The limited evidence prevents confident reconstruction of mortuary practices or social organization. Whether status differentiation existed within Archaic period groups remains unknown, as material culture shows little evidence of wealth distinctions or hierarchical organization. The overall Archaic pattern reflects successful long-term adaptation to Utah's varied environments through technological innovation, diversified subsistence strategies, and flexible settlement systems that balanced mobility with increasing investments in particular locations. Major archaeological sites in Utah provide the primary evidence for reconstructing prehistoric lifeways, with preservation conditions and excavation history shaping understanding of regional sequences. Danger Cave, located in the western Great Basin near Wendover, ranks among the most important sites for documenting long-term occupation patterns. Jesse Jennings conducted excavations at Danger Cave in the early 1950s, recovering stratified deposits spanning approximately 11,000 years. The site consists of a large limestone cave opening onto an ancient Lake Bonneville terrace. Dry conditions inside the cave preserved organic materials, including basketry, cordage, wooden tools, leather fragments, and coprolites. Stone tools recovered include thousands of projectile points, scrapers, and flaked stone debris. Ground stone implements include manos, metates, and other processing tools. Faunal remains show exploitation of small mammals, waterfowl, and occasional larger game. Plant remains indicate intensive seed processing and collection of marsh resources. The site's stratigraphic sequence provided one of the first detailed chronologies for Great Basin prehistory, establishing the long duration and cultural continuity of desert Archaic adaptations. Hog Up Cave, situated near the Great Salt Lake in northwestern Utah, yielded similarly extensive evidence for long-term occupation. Excavations in the 1960s and 70s revealed deposits spanning over 8,000 years. The site location adjacent to marshlands provided access to concentrated resources, including waterfowl, fish, and wetland plants. Preservation conditions allowed recovery of normally perishable items in exceptional quantities. Over 2,000 fragments of basketry came from the deposits, showing manufacturing techniques and stylistic changes through time. Netting fragments demonstrate rabbit hunting technology, with some nets reconstructed to original lengths exceeding 30 meters. Thousands of animal bones document subsistence focus on jackrabbits and other small mammals, with waterfowl bones also abundant. Plant remains include pickleweed seeds, bulrush seeds, and evidence for processing various wetland plants. Coprolite analysis revealed dietary components including seeds, insects, and small bone fragments. The site functioned as a repeatedly occupied base camp, where groups returned seasonally to exploit marsh resources. Cowboy Cave in southeastern Utah provides evidence for Colorado Plateau adaptations. Located in a sandstone alcove along Horseshoe Canyon, the site contained stratified deposits with basketry, cordage, sandals, and wooden implements. Excavations in the 1970s documented occupation from Archaic through late prehistoric periods. Basketry from the site shows construction techniques distinct from Great Basin traditions, reflecting regional variation in manufacturing methods. Plant remains indicate utilization of pinyon nuts, grass seeds, prickly pear, and yucca. Faunal remains include rabbit, deer, and bighorn sheep. The site's canyon setting provided shelter and access to riparian resources along the canyon bottom, while allowing access to mesa-top pinyon juniper woodlands. Materials from Cowboy Cave contributed to understanding Archaic period adaptations in canyon country environments. Sudden Shelter, located in south-central Utah, documented occupation spanning several thousand years. The site sits in a rock shelter overlooking Clear Creek Canyon. Excavations recovered basketry, sandals, and other organic materials along with stone tools and abundant faunal and floral remains. Multiple occupation surfaces show repeated use of the shelter over time. Ground stone tools indicate intensive seed processing. The shelter's location provided access to multiple resource zones within short distances, allowing exploitation of valley bottom, canyon slope, and upland resources. Median Village, situated in central Utah near Salina, represents an example of Fremont culture occupation. The site consists of surface structures and subsurface pit houses. Excavations revealed adobe-walled surface rooms, storage features, and numerous artifacts including ceramics, projectile points, and ground stone tools. Evidence indicates maize agriculture supplemented hunting and gathering. The site location along Salina Creek provided water and arable land for farming. Multiple occupation episodes suggest the site was used repeatedly or continuously over several centuries during the late prehistoric period. Evans Mound, located in northern Utah near Ogden, represents another Fremont site. Excavations in the 1930s documented pit houses, storage pits, and numerous artifacts. The site contained corn remains, ceramics, and stone tools. Architecture included circular pit structures with central hearths. The mound formation resulted from repeated construction and abandonment of structures, gradually building up elevation. Dating suggests occupation during the period from approximately 1,000 to 700 years before present. Paragonar, situated in southern Utah, marks the northern extent of ancestral Puebloan influence. Archaeological investigations documented pit structures transitioning to surface masonry architecture. The site contained ceramics showing both Fremont and Puebloan stylistic influences, reflecting the transitional nature of this border region. Corn, beans, and squash remains indicate agricultural practices. Dating places occupation primarily between 1,200 and 700 years before present. Stein-Acker Gap, located in northeastern Utah, provided evidence for Fremont occupation in the Uinta Basin. The site consists of multiple structures and activity areas. Excavations recovered ceramics, stone tools, and architectural remains. Evidence indicates mixed economy, combining hunting, gathering, and limited horticulture. The Gap location served as a travel corridor between different ecological zones. Old Woman, situated near the Utah-Nevada border, documented late prehistoric occupation in the western Great Basin portion of the state. The site contained surface scatters of stone tools and ground stone implements. Limited excavation revealed subsurface features, including fire hearths and processing areas. Materials indicate continued hunter-gatherer adaptations without adoption of agriculture or ceramics. Delicate Arch, despite its fame as a natural formation, has surrounding areas containing archaeological materials. Petroglyphs and surface artifacts near the arch document prehistoric human presence in the Arches region. The materials reflect temporary camps and travel through this portion of the Colorado Plateau. Newspaper Rock contains one of Utah's most extensive petroglyph panels, with images accumulated over centuries or millennia. The rock art includes representations of bighorn sheep, deer, human figures, and geometric designs. Different styles and patination levels suggest creation across multiple time periods. While difficult to date precisely, stylistic analysis indicates contributions from archaic through late prehistoric times. Barrier Canyon sites contain distinctive pictograph panels in the Horseshoe Canyon area. These images show large anthropomorphic figures executed in dark red pigment. The distinctive style, termed Barrier Canyon style, appears primarily in southeastern Utah. Dating remains uncertain, though most researchers place creation during the Archaic period based on stylistic comparisons and limited direct dating attempts. The images represent one of several rock art traditions documented in Utah. Range Creek Canyon, located in east-central Utah, contains numerous Fremont sites, including granaries, pit houses, and rock art panels. The canyon remained relatively inaccessible until recent decades, preserving sites from looting and disturbance. Archaeological surveys documented hundreds of sites throughout the canyon. Granaries perched in cliff faces stored corn and other foods. Pit house remains show residential occupation. The concentration of sites suggests intensive prehistoric use of the canyon during the Fremont period. These major sites represent only a fraction of documented archaeological locations in Utah. Thousands of additional sites range from small lithic scatters to substantial habitation areas. Surface sites lacking shelter often show poor organic preservation, limiting the types of information recoverable. Many areas remain inadequately surveyed, and new sites continue discovery through professional archaeology and inadvertent exposure. The distribution of known sites reflects both actual prehistoric settlement patterns and modern survey coverage, with some regions intensively investigated while others remain poorly documented. Sites on federal lands receive greater protection and study compared to private lands where development pressures and access restrictions limit archaeological work. The cumulative evidence from major excavated sites provides the framework for understanding Utah's prehistoric past, though substantial gaps and uncertainties remain. Subsistence practices in prehistoric Utah varied by region, elevation, and time period, reflecting the diverse environments and available resources across the state. Hunting constituted a critical component of the economy throughout prehistory, though the relative importance of different prey species shifted based on local ecology and changing environmental conditions. Bighorn sheep hunting occurred in canyon country and mountainous terrain, where these animals inhabited rocky slopes and cliffsides. Archaeological evidence for bighorn hunting includes bones recovered from habitation sites, projectile points found in areas frequented by sheep, and rock art depictions suggesting cultural significance. Hunters likely used knowledge of sheep behavior and movement patterns to position themselves for successful kills. The animals provided meat, hides for clothing and containers, and bone for tool manufacture. Mule deer represented another important large game animal, with remains found at sites across multiple environmental zones. Deer populations occupied diverse habitats from valley bottoms to high mountain forests, migrating seasonally between elevations. Hunters could encounter deer in various settings, depending on season and location. Deer provided substantial meat yields, along with hides, bone, and sinew for technological purposes. Evidence suggests deer were taken individually rather than in mass kills, with hunters using stalking techniques or ambush positions along game trails. Pronghorn antelope inhabited open valleys and plains in some portions of Utah, though their presence and abundance varied regionally. Archaeological evidence for pronghorn hunting appears less frequently than for deer or sheep. The animal's speed and open country habitat made them challenging prey. Where present, pronghorn contributed to subsistence along with other game species. Rabbits and hares constituted critically important resources throughout Utah prehistory. Cottontail rabbits and jackrabbits appear abundantly in faunal assemblages from sites across the state. These small mammals provided reliable, renewable meat sources available year-round. Several hunting techniques targeted rabbits, including individual hunting with projectiles, snaring, and communal net drives. Archaeological evidence for net hunting includes fragments of long nets recovered from dry cave sites. These nets, constructed from cordage twisted from plant fibers, could span considerable distances. Groups of hunters drove rabbits into nets, where they became entangled and could be dispatched. Net hunting likely involved coordinated group effort, potentially providing occasions for social aggregation and cooperation. Rabbit bones processed for food show butchering marks and evidence of cooking. Rabbit skins, sewn together, produced robes and blankets providing insulation. The importance of rabbits in the diet should not be underestimated despite their small individual size, as they could be harvested in substantial quantities. Rodents, including ground squirrels, wood rats, and prairie dogs, supplemented subsistence in some areas. These small mammals appear in faunal assemblages, though in lower frequencies than rabbits. They could be taken opportunistically or targeted specifically depending on local abundance. Birds provided additional meat resources, with waterfowl particularly important in marsh environments. Duck and goose bones appear at sites near wetlands, with seasonal availability corresponding to migration periods. Upland birds, including grouse, occurred in mountain and foothill zones. Raptors and corvids appear occasionally in assemblages, possibly taken for feathers rather than food. Fishing occurred where fish populations existed in rivers and lakes. The Colorado River system and its tributaries contained native fish species. Evidence for fishing includes bone fish hooks, nets, and fish remains in site deposits and coprolites. Fish provided protein sources where available, though many smaller streams and seasonal watercourses lacked fish populations. The importance of fishing varied considerably by location, with riverine sites showing more evidence than upland locations distant from permanent water. Plant food collection and processing formed the subsistence foundation for most prehistoric groups in Utah. Seeds from numerous plant species required collection, processing, and preparation before consumption. Grass seeds, including ricegrass, provided important caloric contributions. These tiny seeds required labor-intensive harvesting, parching, grinding, and cooking. Chenopod seeds and amaranth seeds similarly needed extensive processing. Women likely performed most seed collection and processing work using specialized tools and techniques. Collecting required timing visits to productive patches during seed maturity, sometimes necessitating travel to specific locations during narrow seasonal windows. Pinyon pine nuts represented one of the most important plant foods in regions where pinyon juniper woodlands occurred. Nuts ripen in fall and could be collected from trees or the ground. The nuts have high fat and protein content, providing dense nutrition. Processing required removing shells through pounding or roasting. Nuts store well, allowing accumulation of winter food supplies. However, pinyon production fluctuates dramatically between years, with abundant cone crops occurring irregularly. Groups depending heavily on pinyon needed strategies for coping with crop failures, either through storage from productive years, exploitation of alternative resources, or mobility to regions where crops succeeded. Roots and bulbs provided spring and early summer foods. Various species including yampa, biscuit root, and sego lily produced edible underground storage organs. Collecting roots required knowledge of plant identification and locations, along with digging tools. Women used pointed sticks or specialized digging implements to extract roots. Processing varied by species, with some consumed raw, while others required cooking to break down indigestible compounds. Cactus resources included prickly pear pads and fruits. The pads could be harvested and prepared as vegetables after removing spines. Fruits ripened in late summer and provided sweet, edible pulp. Harvesting required care to avoid spines, likely using tongs or other implements. Agave occurred in southern portions of Utah, with hearts harvested and roasted in earth ovens. This processing required substantial labor investment, but produced large quantities of edible material from single plants. Berries and fruits from various shrubs and trees provided seasonal resources. Service berries, choke cherries, currants, and other species produced fruits in summer and fall. These could be consumed fresh or dried for storage. Berry collecting occurred in productive patches, sometimes requiring travel to mountain zones where fruiting shrubs grew abundantly. Food processing technologies evolved to handle intensive seed and plant preparation. Grinding seeds required manos and metates, with the grinding motion pulverizing seeds into flour or meal. Well-used metates show deep basins worn by repeated grinding. Some sites contain multiple metates, suggesting intensive processing activities or use by multiple individuals simultaneously. Mortars and pestles served for pounding rather than grinding, suitable for nuts, roots, and other materials. Some mortars consist of bedrock depressions, representing fixed processing locations used repeatedly. Cooking methods included roasting, boiling, and baking. Direct roasting over fires prepared some foods. Boiling required watertight containers, achieved through basketry with pitch sealant, or, later, ceramic vessels. Stone boiling involved heating rocks in fires, then dropping them into water-filled containers, transferring heat to boil contents. Earth ovens consisted of pits lined with rocks, filled with foods, covered with earth, and heated for extended periods. This method suited cooking large quantities of roots or agave. Storage facilities allowed preservation of surplus foods. Above-ground granaries constructed in rock shelters protected stored foods from moisture and some pests. These structures typically consisted of stone slabs arranged to form chambers, sometimes with mud mortar. Corn, seeds, and nuts could be stored in such facilities. Below-ground storage pits lined with grass or bark contained cached foods at some sites. Storage enabled accumulation of resources during productive seasons for consumption during less productive times, supporting reduced mobility and population aggregation. Trade and exchange systems moved materials and possibly foods across considerable distances. Marine shell from the Pacific coast appears at interior Utah sites, demonstrating either direct travel to the coast or exchange through intermediate groups. Obsidian moved from source areas to sites lacking local sources, with some toolstone traveling hundreds of kilometers. Turquoise and other minerals moved through exchange networks. The mechanisms of exchange remain incompletely understood, possibly involving gift-giving, direct barter, or formalized trading relationships. Seasonal aggregations may have provided opportunities for exchange when multiple groups gathered at productive resource patches or other meeting locations. Labor organization likely involved division by gender and age, with men primarily responsible for hunting and women for plant collection and processing. Children contributed to subsistence activities as they matured, learning techniques through participation. Elderly individuals provided knowledge and performed tasks compatible with reduced mobility. The overall subsistence pattern emphasized diversity, with groups exploiting multiple resources rather than specializing narrowly. This broad-spectrum approach provided resilience against failure of particular resources, though it required extensive knowledge and investment in varied technologies. Technological developments in prehistoric Utah reflect adaptations to available resources and evolving subsistence strategies over thousands of years. Stone tool manufacture remained fundamental throughout prehistory, with techniques and forms changing in response to functional needs and stylistic preferences. Early stoneworking emphasized bifacial reduction, producing tools flaked on both faces to create cutting edges and points. Toolmakers selected appropriate raw materials from locally available sources or obtained higher quality stone through trade. Obsidian, chert, chalcedony, and quartzite served as primary toolstone materials. Projectile point manufacture involved careful flaking to produce symmetrical forms with sharp edges and functional tips. Different point styles emerged through time, with morphological changes marking chronological periods. Archaic period points tend toward larger sizes suitable for dart-tipped spears propelled by atlatls. Later points became smaller and lighter, reflecting the adoption of bow and arrow technology. The transition from atlatl to bow occurred during the late prehistoric period, roughly between 1,500 and 1,000 years before present. Bow and arrow technology offered advantages in accuracy, rate of fire, and ease of use compared to spear throwers. The shift required manufacturing smaller, lighter projectile points with different hafting requirements. Flaked stone tools beyond projectile points included knives, scrapers, drills, and various cutting implements. Scrapers served for hide processing, woodworking, and other tasks requiring removal of material from surfaces. End scrapers featured steep working edges on one end, while side scrapers had working edges along lateral margins. Drills, identified by pointed tips showing rotational wear, perforated materials including shell, wood, and hide. Knives ranged from formal bifacial implements to simple flakes with sharp edges used for cutting tasks. Groundstone technology expanded significantly during the Archaic period and continued importance through late prehistory. Manos and metates constituted the most common groundstone implements, essential for seed processing. Metates. The stationary grinding surfaces range from flat slabs to deeply basined forms worn concave through repeated use. Manos. The handheld grinding stones show corresponding wear from grinding motions. Different grinding techniques produced various manio forms, with one-hand manos used with reciprocal motion and two-hand manos employed for greater grinding force. The amount of wear on grinding implements indicates intensity of use, with deeply worn metates suggesting years or decades of service. Mortars and pestles served different processing functions than grinding stones. Mortars consisted of stone bowls or bedrock depressions. Pestles, cylindrical stone tools, pounded materials in mortars through vertical percussion. This technology suited processing nuts, roots, and materials requiring crushing rather than grinding. Some sites contain bedrock mortars worn into stone outcrops, representing communal processing locations used repeatedly across generations. Axes, mauls, and hammerstones served for woodworking, food processing, and tool manufacture. Grooved axes with hafting grooves pecked around the tool body allowed secure attachment to wooden handles. These implements chopped wood and performed heavy-duty tasks. Hammerstones, simply selected cobbles with battering marks, drove flakes from stone cores during tool manufacture and served various percussive functions. Fiber technology achieved remarkable sophistication in prehistoric Utah, documented through preserved organic materials from dry caves. Basketry manufacture required extensive knowledge of plant materials, harvesting techniques, and construction methods. Different basket forms served distinct functions. Coiled baskets, constructed by wrapping a foundation element with binding material, produced strong containers suitable for storage and cooking. Close-coiled baskets held water when constructed tightly, enabling stone boiling before ceramic adoption. Twined baskets, made by twisting weft elements around vertical warp elements, ranged from tightly constructed containers to open work forms. Plaited baskets interwove elements at right angles, producing flexible containers and mats. Basket construction techniques showed regional variation, with Great Basin and Colorado Plateau traditions exhibiting distinct characteristics. Materials varied by availability, with willow, sumac, yucca, and various grasses serving as common elements. Basket makers selected appropriate materials for specific basket types, matching plant properties to functional requirements. Manufacturing a single basket required days or weeks of work, representing substantial labor investment. Sandals protected feet during travel across rough terrain. Numerous sandal fragments recovered from cave sites document construction techniques and stylistic variation through time. Early sandals consisted of shredded juniper bark or yucca fibers woven into flat forms. Later examples show more complex construction with multiple layers and elaborate knotting. Sandal styles change through time, with specific forms characterizing particular periods. Worn sandals show repair episodes, indicating extended use and value of these items. Cordage manufacture transformed plant fibers into strong, flexible rope for multiple purposes. Yucca leaves, milkweed fibers, dogbane, and other plant materials provided suitable fibers. Processing involved drying, splitting, and twisting fibers together. Two-ply cordage consisted of two elements twisted together, with direction of twist varying. Thicker cordage combined multiple elements. Cordage served for net manufacture, snares, hafting bindings, and construction purposes. The quantity of cordage recovered from some sites indicates intensive and ongoing production. Nets served primarily for rabbit hunting, with some examples reconstructed to lengths exceeding 30 meters. Net manufacture required substantial cordage production, followed by knotting cordage into mesh patterns. Net mesh size varied depending on intended prey, with smaller meshes for cottontails and larger for jackrabbits. Using nets required multiple hunters to drive rabbits into deployed nets. The labor investment in net manufacture and the coordination required for use suggest communal activities and possibly ritual significance. Wooden implements included digging sticks, throwing sticks, fire drills, and various other tools. Digging sticks served for excavating roots and constructing features. Throwing sticks, similar to boomerangs, killed small game. Fire-making equipment included wooden drills rotated against hearthboards to generate friction heat igniting tinder. Bow and arrow technology required carefully manufactured bows and arrows with proper flex characteristics and balance. Ceramic technology developed relatively late in Utah prehistory, appearing around 1,500 years before, present in some regions. Pottery manufacture required suitable clay, tempering materials, forming techniques, and firing procedures. Potters collected clay from appropriate sources, removed impurities, and added temper such as crushed rock or sand to improve workability and reduce cracking during drying and firing. Vessels formed through coiling, with clay coils stacked and smoothed to create walls. Surface treatments included smoothing, polishing, or corrugating. Decoration techniques included incising, applique, and painted designs. Ceramic vessel forms included jars, bowls, and specialty forms. Jars with constricted necks stored liquids and seeds. Wide-mouthed bowls served for cooking and serving. Pottery enabled boiling without stone boiling techniques, improving cooking efficiency. However, ceramic vessels were heavy and fragile, limiting utility for highly mobile groups. The adoption of pottery correlates with increasing sedentism in some regions. Fremont ceramics, characteristic of eastern and central Utah, show distinctive attributes including gray wares with incised or applique decoration. Vessel forms include jars, bowls, and unique items like ceramic figurines. Fremont potters produced both utilitarian vessels and more elaborate decorated forms. Regional variation in Fremont ceramics suggests local production traditions and limited exchange of finished vessels. Ancestral Puebloan ceramics appear in southern Utah, reflecting connections with groups to the south. These wares include both gray utility vessels and decorated black-on-white forms. Painted designs show geometric patterns and occasionally representational elements. The presence of Puebloan-style ceramics in southern Utah documents cultural connections and possibly population movements or exchange relationships. Architectural technologies evolved from simple windbreaks and brush structures toward more substantial construction. Early shelters consisted of perishable materials, leaving minimal archaeological traces. Pit houses, semi-subterranean structures, appear during the late prehistoric period. Construction involved excavating circular or rectangular pits, erecting wooden posts around the perimeter, and covering with roofs of poles, brush, and earth. Central fire hearths provided heating and cooking areas. Pit houses offered insulation and stability compared to surface structures. Surface masonry architecture developed in some regions, particularly in southern Utah, where ancestral Puebloan influences extended. Stone masonry walls constructed from shaped sandstone blocks formed room enclosures. Adobe, made from clay-rich mud, sometimes supplemented stone construction. Room blocks containing multiple connected rooms housed families or groups. Storage rooms, smaller than habitation rooms, secured food and materials. Granaries, specialized storage structures, appear in cliff faces and rock shelters across Utah. These small stone structures protected stored corn and other foods from moisture, pests, and possibly theft. Construction required accessing difficult cliff locations, suggesting the value placed on secure storage. Some granaries occur in locations accessible only by climbing or using ladders. The cumulative technological repertoire of prehistoric Utah populations demonstrates sophisticated understanding of available materials and effective manufacturing techniques. Technologies evolved gradually through experimentation and knowledge transmission across generations. Regional variation in technological approaches reflects both environmental constraints and cultural traditions, distinguishing different groups. The preservation of organic materials in Utah's dry environments provides unusual insight into technological systems that would remain invisible in most archaeological contexts. Evidence for social complexity in prehistoric Utah remains limited compared to regions where hierarchical societies developed. Most indicators suggest relatively egalitarian social organization throughout much of the prehistoric sequence, with leadership based on achievement, age, and knowledge rather than inherited status. However, certain material patterns and site characteristics provide insights into social relationships, conflict, inequality, and organizational structures. The interpretation of these patterns remains debated, with researchers disagreeing about the degree of social differentiation and the mechanisms of group coordination. Warfare and conflict leave archaeological traces, including defensive site locations, traumatic skeletal injuries, and fortification features. Some late prehistoric sites in Utah occupied defensible positions on mesa tops, ridges, or cliff faces accessible only through restricted routes. Whether these locations were chosen primarily for defense or for other reasons, including viewsheds, climate moderation, or symbolic significance, cannot be definitively determined. The strategic placement suggests at minimum some concern for security. Fremont sites in particular sometimes occupy elevated or protected positions that would be difficult to approach undetected. Skeletal evidence for violence appears sporadically in prehistoric Utah burials. Some individuals show healed or fatal injuries consistent with interpersonal violence, including depressed skull fractures, embedded projectile points, and defensive arm fractures. The frequency of such injuries remains low in documented burial populations, suggesting that violence occurred but was not pervasive. Whether violent encounters represented warfare between groups, raiding, interpersonal disputes, or execution of criminals cannot be distinguished from skeletal evidence alone. The presence of any violent trauma indicates that conflict existed at some level. Fortification features, including walls, towers, and restricted site access, appear at some late prehistoric sites. These architectural elements suggest defensive concerns, though they may have served multiple functions, including storage security, symbolic display, or climate control. Distinguishing defensive from non-defensive functions proves difficult without clear evidence of attacks or siege events. Some researchers interpret certain architectural features as defensive, while others propose alternative explanations. The ambiguity reflects limitations in archaeological inference from material remains. Burial practices provide insights into beliefs about death and potentially social differentiation. Most documented burials from prehistoric Utah show relatively simple treatment with bodies placed in flexed or extended positions in pits or rock shelters. Grave goods accompany some individuals, but not others. The variation in burial treatment could reflect social status, age, gender, circumstances of death, or temporal changes in mortuary practices. Distinguishing between these possibilities requires large burial populations with controlled excavation and documentation, which remain rare for prehistoric Utah. Some burials contain more elaborate grave goods than others, potentially indicating status distinctions. Items found with burials include projectile points, beads, baskets, and occasionally more unusual objects. Whether these represent personal possessions, gifts from survivors, or status markers remains uncertain. In societies without strong hereditary inequality, burial goods often reflect achieved status, personal preferences, or situational factors rather than social class. The presence of variation does not necessarily indicate hierarchical organization. Shell bead production and distribution provides potential evidence for prestige goods economies. Marine shell from the Pacific coast appears at sites across Utah, manufactured into beads, pendants, and ornaments. The labor investment in obtaining shell from distant sources and manufacturing beads suggests these items held value. Whether shell ornaments served as currency, wealth items, or simply decorative objects remains debated. Some researchers argue that shell beads functioned as a form of proto-currency facilitating exchange, while others maintain they served primarily symbolic or decorative functions without standardized exchange value. The quantity of shell beads at different sites varies considerably. Some locations yield abundant shell, while others contain little or none. This distribution could reflect differential wealth, varied access to exchange networks, functional site differences, or preservation bias. Sites with more shell may have housed individuals with greater exchange relationships or social connections, rather than higher status. Alternatively, shell accumulations at certain locations might represent manufacturing areas rather than residential sites of elites. Evidence for craft specialization remains limited in prehistoric Utah. Most tool types and other artifacts show production at household levels rather than by specialized craftspeople. Basketry, cordage, stone tools, and other items appear to have been manufactured by individuals for personal use or small-scale exchange, rather than by specialists producing for redistribution. The absence of clear specialization suggests that economic organization remained relatively simple without strong division of labor beyond basic age and gender patterns. Some researchers argue that certain elaborate artifacts suggest specialist production. Particularly well-made baskets, finely worked projectile points, or distinctive ceramic vessels might represent the work of skilled individuals who devoted more time to perfecting techniques. However, skilled production does not necessarily indicate full-time specialization or attached specialists working for elites. Individuals with particular talents could produce high-quality items while maintaining subsistence activities. Leadership structures remain archaeologically invisible for the most part, as political organization leaves few material traces unless supported by monumental architecture, palaces, or other built expressions of authority. The absence of such features in prehistoric Utah suggests leadership operated at modest scales. Bands and small villages likely had informal leaders whose authority derived from age, knowledge, hunting prowess, or other achieved qualities. Such leadership typically did not translate into material wealth accumulation or the ability to command labor for monument construction. The organization of communal activities, including net drives, construction projects, or ceremonies, required coordination, but not necessarily institutionalized leadership. Small groups can organize collective action through consensus, with different individuals taking leadership roles for different activities. An excellent hunter might lead hunting expeditions, while a knowledgeable elder guided resource collection timing and locations. Such task-specific leadership differs from permanent political authority. Fremont sites with multiple pit houses and substantial storage facilities suggest coordination at village or supra-household levels. The construction of pit houses required labor beyond single households, potentially indicating cooperative work groups. Storage granaries perched in cliffs required construction skill and knowledge of appropriate locations. Whether single families controlled these facilities or they served community functions remains unclear. The scale of investment in some sites suggests multifamily cooperation, though this does not necessarily indicate hierarchical control. Rock art may have served roles in ritual, territorial marking, or social communication, though interpretation remains highly speculative. The prominent placement of some rock art panels in visible locations suggests public messaging rather than private expression. Whether shamans, leaders, or community members created rock art cannot be determined from the images themselves. The investment of labor in creating elaborate panels indicates these images held significance, though the specific meanings remain inaccessible. Regional variation in artifact styles and architectural forms suggests group identity and social boundaries. Fremont groups in different areas produced ceramics with distinctive decorative styles, potentially marking regional identities. Whether these variations represent conscious identity markers or simply reflect learned traditions and available materials cannot be definitively determined. The patterns indicate that groups recognized regional affiliations and maintained traditions distinguishing them from neighbors. Exchange networks demonstrate social relationships extending beyond local groups. The movement of obsidian, shell, and other materials indicates connections between distant populations. Whether exchange occurred through direct contact Intermediaries or down-the-line transfer affects interpretations of social organization. Direct long-distance travel by individuals suggests personal mobility and possible specialized traders. Down-the-line exchange through neighbors indicates social networks without specialized trading roles. Archaeological evidence alone cannot distinguish these mechanisms. Population aggregation at certain sites during particular periods suggests occasional larger social gatherings. Sites with evidence of intensive short-term occupation may represent seasonal aggregations where multiple groups gathered for resource exploitation, ceremonies, or social interaction. These aggregations would have provided opportunities for exchange, mate selection, information sharing, and conflict resolution. The organization of such gatherings required coordination, but not necessarily permanent authority structures. Conflict resolution mechanisms remain archaeologically invisible unless disputes escalated to violence, leaving skeletal evidence. Small-scale societies typically resolve disputes through mediation by respected individuals, avoidance through group fission, or compensation payments. These mechanisms function without formal political institutions or enforcement authorities. The relatively low frequency of violent skeletal trauma suggests that conflict management generally succeeded in preventing lethal violence, though this may reflect small populations and the option of relocating rather than effective institutional controls. The overall picture suggests social organization based on kinship, reciprocity, and achieved status rather than institutionalized inequality or political hierarchy. This pattern characterized most of Utah's prehistory, with possible exceptions or elaborations during the late prehistoric Fremont period in some areas. Even Fremont society shows limited evidence for strong hierarchical organization compared to contemporary Mississippian societies in eastern North America or Hohokam groups in Arizona. The archaeological signature indicates populations organized at band and village levels without the centralized authority, labor mobilization, or material inequality characteristic of chiefdom or state societies. This social organization proved effective for the subsistence strategies and environmental conditions of prehistoric Utah. The late prehistoric period in Utah, spanning roughly 1,000 to 500 years before present, witnessed significant changes in settlement patterns, subsistence practices, and regional cultural expressions before European contact disrupted indigenous lifeways. This interval saw the florescence and subsequent decline of Fremont culture in eastern and central Utah, continued hunting and gathering adaptations in the Great Basin West, and complex interactions along the southern border with ancestral Puebloan populations. Population levels, agricultural intensification, and territorial organization shifted during this period in ways that remain incompletely understood. Fremont culture reached its maximum extent and elaboration during the early portion of the late prehistoric period, roughly between 1,000 and 600 years before present. During this interval, Fremont groups occupied numerous villages with pit house architecture, cultivated corn and other crops in suitable locations, manufactured distinctive ceramics, and created elaborate rock art. Settlement distributions expanded into areas that had seen less intensive occupation during earlier periods. Population estimates for the Fremont region suggest several thousand individuals distributed across central and eastern Utah, though precise demographic reconstructions remain speculative, given incomplete survey coverage and uncertain site contemporaneity. Agricultural production intensified in some Fremont areas, with evidence for field systems, irrigation features, and expanded storage facilities. Groups invested labor in preparing agricultural fields, potentially including clearing vegetation, leveling surfaces, and constructing water control features. The degree of agricultural dependence varied considerably across the Fremont region, with some groups deriving substantial portions of their diet from cultivated crops, while others maintained economies dominated by hunting and gathering with horticultural supplementation. Environmental variability influenced agricultural feasibility, with river valleys and areas with reliable water permitting more intensive farming than arid uplands. Storage infrastructure expanded during the Fremont Florescence, with numerous granaries constructed in protected cliff locations. These stone structures provided secure storage for harvested corn and other foods. The investment in storage facilities indicates planning for future needs and accumulation of surplus production beyond immediate consumption requirements. Storage enabled populations to remain at villages through winter months rather than dispersing to forage. However, reliance on stored foods created vulnerability to harvest failures or storage loss through pests, moisture, or theft. Population aggregation in some Fremont villages suggests increasing sedentism and potentially larger social units than characteristic of earlier Archaic period bands. Villages with multiple pit houses indicate residential groups exceeding single extended families. These aggregations required social mechanisms for conflict resolution, resource allocation, and coordination of activities. Whether villages had formal leadership structures or operated through consensus decision-making cannot be determined from archaeological evidence. The spatial organization of some villages with central plazas or communal areas suggests shared community spaces, though their specific functions remain uncertain. Fremont material culture reached its greatest elaboration during this period. Ceramic production included both utilitarian gray ware vessels and more carefully finished forms with incised or applique decoration. Figurine manufacture represents a distinctive Fremont practice, with small clay human figures found at various sites. These figurines show stylistic variation, but share general characteristics, including emphasis on upper body details. Whether figurines served ritual, educational, or decorative purposes remains unknown. Their presence indicates symbolic or social practices beyond purely utilitarian concerns. Rock art production continued or intensified during the late Fremont period. Numerous panels with characteristic Fremont anthropomorphic figures date to this interval based on style and superimposition relationships. The prominence of rock art in Fremont territories suggests symbolic communication held importance, though deciphering specific meanings proves impossible without ethnographic or textual information. Researchers have proposed astronomical, shamanic, territorial, and narrative interpretations, but these remain speculative. Around 600 to 500 years before present, Fremont cultural patterns underwent substantial changes across much of their former range. Many villages were abandoned. Agricultural practices declined or ceased in areas where they had previously flourished. The archaeological signature characteristic of Fremont culture largely disappears from the record. This transformation represents one of the major unresolved questions in Utah prehistory. Researchers debate whether Fremont groups migrated from the region, were replaced by incoming populations, or transformed their cultural practices while remaining in place. Several explanations have been proposed for Fremont decline. Climate change represents one commonly cited factor, with deteriorating conditions during the transition from the medieval climate anomaly to cooler, more variable conditions, potentially making agriculture increasingly marginal in areas where it previously succeeded. Shorter growing seasons, increased frost risk, or reduced precipitation could have undermined crop production, forcing abandonment of agricultural villages. However, climate change alone may not fully explain the cultural transformation, as groups could have reverted to hunting and gathering without complete regional abandonment. Population movements potentially contributed to Fremont decline. Some researchers argue that Numic-speaking groups expanded into Utah from the south or west, displacing or absorbing Fremont populations. This Numic expansion model suggests that ancestors of modern Ute, Paiute, and Shoshone groups entered Utah during the late prehistoric period, replacing or assimilating Fremont peoples. Linguistic and ethnographic evidence provide some support for relatively recent pneumic expansion, though the timing and mechanisms remain debated. Archaeological evidence for population replacement proves difficult to demonstrate, as material culture changes do not necessarily indicate population substitution. Alternative interpretations suggest Fremont groups remained in place, but abandoned horticultural practices and architectural styles that had characterized their culture, returning to more mobile hunting and gathering patterns in response to environmental or social pressures. Under this scenario, cultural change occurred without major population replacement, representing adaptive flexibility rather than demographic collapse. Distinguishing between population continuity with cultural change versus population replacement requires genetic and skeletal evidence that remains limited for the relevant time periods and regions. In the Great Basin portions of western Utah, groups maintained hunting and gathering adaptations through the late prehistoric period without adoption of agriculture or other Fremont characteristics. Archaeological evidence shows continuity with earlier archaic patterns, indicating that these populations successfully maintained traditional subsistence strategies. The absence of major transformations in the Great Basin contrasts with eastern and central Utah, suggesting that whatever factors caused Fremont decline had limited impact in western regions where horticulture had never been significant. Southern Utah showed influences from ancestral Puebloan groups centered in the Four Corners region. During the late prehistoric period before Puebloan abandonments in that area, populations in southernmost Utah participated in networks extending into Arizona, Colorado, and New Mexico. Sites show architectural and ceramic characteristics linking them to Puebloan traditions. These connections demonstrate that Utah's southern border regions maintained interaction with populations to the south, though whether this involved population movement, exchange relationships, or cultural emulation remains uncertain. Trade networks during the late prehistoric period moved materials across considerable distances. Obsidian from specific sources circulated widely. Marine shell continued arriving from the Pacific coast. Turquoise and other minerals moved through exchange systems. The volume and geographic extent of exchange may have increased during the late prehistoric period compared to earlier times, though quantifying exchange intensity from archaeological data proves challenging. Whether specialized traders facilitated long-distance exchange or materials moved through incremental transfers between neighbors cannot be determined definitively. Projectile point styles transitioned during the late prehistoric period, with arrow points replacing larger dart points. This shift reflects the adoption of bow and arrow technology, which occurred at different times in different regions. The bow offered advantages in hunting efficiency, accuracy, and rate of fire. Arrow points, smaller and lighter than dart points, show distinct morphological characteristics. The spread of bow technology represents a significant technological change affecting hunting strategies and success rates. Population estimates at the end of the late prehistoric period remain highly uncertain. For the Fremont region, populations had likely declined from earlier peaks, though the degree of decline and its causes remain debated. Great Basin populations appear to have remained relatively stable at modest levels. Southern border areas may have seen population fluctuations tied to broader demographic patterns in the Puebloan Southwest. Overall regional population probably numbered in the low thousands, distributed across diverse environments and maintaining varied subsistence strategies. Demographic reconstructions remain speculative given incomplete site surveys, uncertain site dating, and difficulties distinguishing contemporaneous from sequential occupations. The immediate pre-contact period, the final decades before European influence reached Utah, saw indigenous populations organized in small mobile bands in most areas, pursuing hunting and gathering economies adapted to local environments. The elaborate village patterns of the Fremont period had largely vanished. Groups maintained technologies effective for exploiting available resources, including sophisticated basketry, stone tools, cordage, and other implements. Social organization operated at family and band levels without evidence for complex hierarchies or political centralization. These patterns would undergo catastrophic disruption following European contact and the associated introduction of diseases, horses, and colonial pressures. Population estimates for Utah at the time of European contact remain uncertain and debated among researchers. The lack of direct European observation of indigenous populations in Utah until the 18th century complicates demographic reconstruction. Early Spanish explorers passed through the region beginning in the 1500s, but systematic documentation did not occur until later. By the time detailed ethnographic observation began, indigenous populations had already suffered substantial decline from introduced diseases, making pre-contact population estimates dependent on archaeological evidence and extrapolation from better documented regions. Archaeological site distributions and carrying capacity estimates suggest that pre-contact populations in Utah numbered in the low thousands to perhaps 10,000 individuals, though these figures involve considerable uncertainty. Population density varied dramatically by region, with higher concentrations in areas with reliable water and productive resources, while vast arid zones supported only sparse populations. The Great Basin portions of western Utah likely supported relatively low population densities, given limited water and dispersed resources. River valleys and areas near marshes concentrated populations. Mountain zones saw seasonal use but probably not permanent year-round occupation by large numbers. Ethnographic accounts from the 18th and 19th centuries describe Ute, Paiute, and Shoshone groups occupying different portions of Utah. These populations organized in small family bands that moved seasonally to exploit resources across extensive territories. Band sizes typically ranged from perhaps 20 to 100 individuals, consisting of related families who cooperated in subsistence activities and maintained social ties. Larger aggregations occurred seasonally at productive resource patches, including pinyon groves during harvest years, or at communal rabbit drives. Political organization remained decentralized, with leadership based on achievement and consensus rather than formal authority. The relationship between these historically documented populations and prehistoric groups remains debated. Whether Ute, Paiute, and Shoshone populations represent direct descendants of Fremont and Archaic period peoples, or resulted from population movements and replacements, cannot be definitively determined from available evidence. Linguistic affiliations show that these groups speak Numic languages within the Uto-Aztecan family. Some researchers argue for relatively recent Numic expansion into the Great Basin and Colorado Plateau, while others propose longer population continuity with language change. Resolution of this question requires integration of archaeological, linguistic, genetic, and ethnographic evidence. European contact occurred indirectly before any Europeans entered Utah, as diseases spread through indigenous trade networks ahead of direct colonial presence. Smallpox, measles, and other infectious diseases to which native populations lacked immunity caused catastrophic mortality rates. Epidemics swept through indigenous populations beginning in the 16th century, following Spanish colonization of Mexico and the Southwest. The diseases spread from group to group through trade contacts and population movements, reaching areas Europeans had not yet visited. Multiple epidemic waves reduced populations by estimated 75 to 90% in some regions, though precise mortality rates for Utah remain unknown given the absence of population documentation before disease impacts. The demographic collapse from introduced diseases fundamentally disrupted indigenous societies across the Americas. Population decline caused social disintegration as deaths outpaced population replacement. Traditional knowledge held by elders disappeared as disease killed disproportionate numbers of older individuals. Communities fragmented as survivors dispersed or amalgamated with other groups. Social institutions and cultural practices dependent on particular population sizes or social structures could not be maintained. The scale of mortality and disruption exceeded anything in European experience, representing perhaps the greatest demographic catastrophe in human history. Spanish exploration reached the edges of Utah in the 16th century, with expeditions traversing regions to the south and west. The Dominguez Escalante expedition passed through western Colorado and portions of Utah in 1776, providing the first documented European observation of parts of the region. Spanish accounts describe small bands of indigenous peoples subsisting through hunting and gathering. These descriptions likely documented populations already substantially reduced by disease and disrupted from pre-contact patterns. The Spanish expedition sought routes to California and missionary opportunities, but established no permanent presence in Utah during the colonial period. The fur trade brought Euro-American trappers into Utah beginning in the early 1800s. Mountain men, including Jedediah Smith, Jim Bridger, and others, explored the region in search of beaver and other fur-bearing animals. Contact between trappers and indigenous populations remained sporadic, with some trading and occasional conflicts. The presence of Euro-Americans further disrupted indigenous economies and introduced additional diseases. Trapping pressure reduced beaver populations in many streams, affecting both the ecology and indigenous resource use patterns. Mormon settlement, beginning in 1847, brought permanent Euro-American colonization to Utah. The rapid establishment of agricultural settlements in valleys across the territory displaced indigenous populations from traditional resource areas and water sources. Competition for resources intensified as Mormon populations grew and expanded into new areas. Agricultural development eliminated or reduced wild plant and animal populations that indigenous groups depended upon. Springs and streams were diverted for irrigation, reducing water available for indigenous use. Traditional seasonal rounds became impossible as lands were fenced and cultivated. Conflicts arose between Mormon settlers and indigenous groups as competition for resources intensified. Raids, killings, and reprisals occurred on both sides. Indigenous groups sometimes raided Mormon livestock and stores, while settlers organized militias and punitive expeditions. The Walker War in the 1850s and the Black Hawk War in the 1860s represented major conflicts resulting from the displacement and resource competition. These wars, combined with disease, starvation from resource loss, and forced relocations, further reduced indigenous populations. Federal policies aimed at removing indigenous populations from desired lands and concentrating them on reservations. The Uinta Valley Reservation was established in 1861 in northeastern Utah, though indigenous groups resisted relocation. Forced removals attempted to concentrate scattered bands onto reservations where they could be controlled and assimilated. Traditional subsistence practices became impossible on restricted reservation lands with inadequate resources to support populations. Dependence on government rations and supplies replaced autonomous hunting and gathering economies. By the late 19th century, indigenous populations in Utah had declined to a fraction of pre-contact levels. Survivors lived on reservations or in scattered small groups, their traditional lifeways largely destroyed. The languages, technologies, subsistence practices, and social organizations that had developed over 12,000 years of adaptation to Utah's diverse environments survived only in fragmentary form. Some knowledge persisted through oral traditions and continued practice of certain crafts and techniques, But much was lost as population collapse and cultural disruption severed transmission between generations. The archaeological record documents 12,000 years of successful human adaptation to Utah's environments, with populations developing sophisticated technologies and subsistence strategies appropriate to available resources. Groups maintained themselves through environmental changes, including major climate shifts, demonstrating flexibility and resilience. Regional differentiation produced distinct cultural traditions adapted to particular ecological settings. Social organizations operated at scales appropriate to population densities and subsistence systems. This long prehistory ended abruptly with European contact and the cascade of diseases, displacement, and disruption that followed. The material traces preserved in dry caves, rock shelters, and open sites represent the only remaining evidence for most of this human past, as the societies that created these materials did not survive intact into the period of ethnographic documentation. The prehistoric populations of Utah developed complex adaptations, allowing successful occupation across diverse and often challenging environments over many millennia, a record of human achievement and adaptation that ended with the arrival of peoples and pathogens from other continents. Population estimates for Utah at the time of European contact remain uncertain and debated among researchers. The lack of direct European observation of indigenous populations in Utah until the 18th century complicates demographic reconstruction. Early Spanish explorers passed through the region beginning in the 1500s, but systematic documentation did not occur until later. By the time detailed ethnographic observation began, indigenous populations had already suffered substantial decline from introduced diseases, making pre-contact population estimates dependent on archaeological evidence and extrapolation from better documented regions. Archaeological site distributions and carrying capacity estimates suggest that pre-contact populations in Utah numbered in the low thousands to perhaps 10,000 individuals, though these figures involve considerable uncertainty. Population density varied dramatically by region, with higher concentrations in areas with reliable water and productive resources, while vast arid zones supported only sparse populations. The Great Basin portions of western Utah likely supported relatively low population densities, given limited water and dispersed resources. River valleys and areas near marshes concentrated populations. Mountain zones saw seasonal use, but probably not permanent year-round occupation by large numbers. Ethnographic accounts from the 18th and 19th centuries describe Ute, Paiute, and Shoshone groups occupying different portions of Utah. These populations organized in small family bands that moved seasonally to exploit resources across extensive territories. Band sizes typically ranged from perhaps 20 to 100 individuals, consisting of related families who cooperated in subsistence activities and maintained social ties. Larger aggregations occurred seasonally at productive resource patches, including pinyon groves during harvest years or at communal rabbit drives. Political organization remained decentralized, with leadership based on achievement and consensus rather than formal authority. The relationship between these historically documented populations and prehistoric groups remains debated. Whether Ute, Paiute, and Shoshone populations represent direct descendants of Fremont and Archaic period peoples, or resulted from population movements and replacements, cannot be definitively determined from available evidence. Linguistic affiliations show that these groups speak Numic languages within the Uto-Aztecan family. Some researchers argue for relatively recent Numic expansion into the Great Basin and Colorado Plateau, while others propose longer population continuity with language change. Resolution of this question requires integration of archaeological, linguistic, genetic, and ethnographic evidence. European contact occurred indirectly before any Europeans entered Utah. as diseases spread through indigenous trade networks ahead of direct colonial presence. Smallpox, measles, and other infectious diseases to which native populations lacked immunity caused catastrophic mortality rates. Epidemics swept through indigenous populations beginning in the 16th century, following Spanish colonization of Mexico and the Southwest. The diseases spread from group to group through trade contacts and population movements, reaching areas Europeans had not yet visited. Multiple epidemic waves reduced populations by estimated 75 to 90% in some regions, though precise mortality rates for Utah remain unknown, given the absence of population documentation before disease impacts. The demographic collapse from introduced diseases fundamentally disrupted indigenous societies across the Americas. Population decline caused social disintegration as deaths outpaced population replacement. Traditional knowledge held by elders disappeared as disease killed disproportionate numbers of older individuals. Communities fragmented as survivors dispersed or amalgamated with other groups. Social institutions and cultural practices dependent on particular population sizes or social structures could not be maintained. The scale of mortality and disruption exceeded anything in European experience, representing perhaps the greatest demographic catastrophe in human history. Spanish exploration reached the edges of Utah in the 16th century, with expeditions traversing regions to the south and west. The Dominguez Escalante expedition passed through western Colorado and portions of Utah in 1776, providing the first documented European observation of parts of the region. Spanish accounts describe small bands of indigenous peoples subsisting through hunting and gathering. These descriptions likely documented populations already substantially reduced by disease and disrupted from pre-contact patterns. The Spanish expedition sought routes to California and missionary opportunities, but established no permanent presence in Utah during the colonial period. The fur trade brought Euro-American trappers into Utah beginning in the early 1800s. Mountain men, including Jedediah Smith, Jim Bridger, and others explored the region in search of beaver and other fur-bearing animals. Contact between trappers and indigenous populations remained sporadic, with some trading and occasional conflicts. The presence of Euro-Americans further disrupted indigenous economies and introduced additional diseases. Trapping pressure reduced beaver populations in many streams, affecting both the ecology and indigenous resource use patterns. Mormon settlement beginning in 1847 brought permanent Euro-American colonization to Utah. The rapid establishment of agricultural settlements in valleys across the territory displaced indigenous populations from traditional resource areas and water sources. Competition for resources intensified as Mormon populations grew and expanded into new areas. Agricultural development eliminated or reduced wild plant and animal populations that indigenous groups depended upon. Springs and streams were diverted for irrigation, reducing water available for indigenous use. Traditional seasonal rounds became impossible as lands were fenced and cultivated. Conflicts arose between Mormon settlers and indigenous groups as competition for resources intensified. Raids, killings, and reprisals occurred on both sides. Indigenous groups sometimes raided Mormon livestock and stores, while settlers organized militias and punitive expeditions. The Walker War in the 1850s and the Black Hawk War in the 1860s represented major conflicts resulting from the displacement and resource competition. These wars, combined with disease, starvation from resource loss, and forced relocations, further reduced indigenous populations. Federal policies aimed at removing indigenous populations from desired lands and concentrating them on reservations. The Uintah Valley Reservation was established in 1861 in northeastern Utah, though indigenous groups resisted relocation. Forced removals attempted to concentrate scattered bands onto reservations where they could be controlled and assimilated. traditional subsistence practices became impossible on restricted reservation lands with inadequate resources to support populations. Dependence on government rations and supplies replaced autonomous hunting and gathering economies. By the late 19th century, indigenous populations in Utah had declined to a fraction of pre-contact levels. Survivors lived on reservations or in scattered small groups, their traditional lifeways largely destroyed. The languages, technologies, subsistence practices, and social organizations that had developed over 12,000 years of adaptation to Utah's diverse environments survived only in fragmentary form. Some knowledge persisted through oral traditions and continued practice of certain crafts and techniques, but much was lost as population collapse and cultural disruption severed transmission between generations. The archaeological record documents 12,000 years of successful human adaptation to Utah's environments, with populations developing sophisticated technologies and subsistence strategies appropriate to available resources. Groups maintained themselves through environmental changes, including major climate shifts, demonstrating flexibility and resilience. Regional differentiation produced distinct cultural traditions adapted to particular ecological settings. Social organizations operated at scales appropriate to population densities and subsistence systems. This long prehistory ended abruptly with European contact and the cascade of diseases, displacement, and disruption that followed. The material traces preserved in dry caves, rock shelters, and open sites represent the only remaining evidence for most of this human past, as the societies that created these materials did not survive intact into the period of ethnographic documentation. The prehistoric populations of Utah developed complex adaptations, allowing successful occupation across diverse and often challenging environments over many millennia. A record of human achievement and adaptation that ended with the arrival of peoples and pathogens from other continents.